The morning Callie Marsh turned 18, nobody baked a cake. There was no party, no balloons taped to a door frame, no candles to blow out with a wish pressed behind your teeth. There was just the gray light of a November dawn coming through the narrow window above her bunk, the distant sound of a radiator knocking against the cold, and the particular silence of a building full of people pretending to sleep. She had been awake for hours. She knew what the day meant. She had known for months the way you know a storm is coming, not because you can see it, but because you can feel it in your bones, a pressure that builds until the air itself feels wrong. 18 meant the clock had run out. 18 meant the system that had fed her and housed her and filed her under case number 412 was done with her. Today, the state of Vermont was going to open a door and point outside, and that was going to be that. Callie lay still and listened to the building wake up around her. She had been at Hargrove House for 2 years. Before that, 2 different foster placements, neither of which lasted more than 8 months. Before that, a hospital waiting room where a woman with kind eyes and a bad coffee habit had explained to a 16-year-old girl that her parents were not coming home. The ice on Route 9 had been bad that night. The truck had crossed the center line. There was nothing anyone could have done. She had learned in the years since to hold that sentence at arm's length. There was nothing anyone could have done. She kept it away from herself the way you keep a hot pan away from bare skin, not because it wasn't true, but because if she let herself really sit with it, if she let it get close enough to settle, she didn't know what shape she would be when it was finished with her. Surviving required a certain discipline of thought. She had gotten good at it. By 7 in the morning, she was dressed. Everything she owned fit into a single canvas bag she had found at a church sale 2 summers ago. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a wool sweater with a small hole at the left cuff she had never gotten around to fixing, a paperback novel she had already read 4 times because it was the only book she had, a photograph of her mother taken sometime in the mid-90s blurry at the edges. Catching a woman mid-laugh in a yellow kitchen, Callie had no memory of ever standing in. She carried the bag down the hall to the office of Ms. Vreeland, the facility director, who was a woman shaped by decades of institutional necessity into something that resembled warmth without quite being it. Ms. Vreeland had a way of looking at you that suggested she genuinely cared and was also very tired of genuinely caring, and these 2 things existed in her expression simultaneously at all times. The office smelled of old paper and the particular brand of hand lotion Ms. Vreeland had used for as long as Callie could remember. There was a potted plant on the windowsill that had been dying slowly for at least a year. Nobody had the heart to throw it out. "Sit down, Callie." She sat. Ms. Vreeland folded her hands on the desk. She had done this before this specific conversation with this specific posture, and her body knew the shape of it, even if her voice still searched for the right words. "We've processed your transition documents. The state-issued assistance comes to $100. There's a bus voucher included, and there is one additional item that came through probate last week." She slid a manila envelope across the desk. It was thin. Callie picked it up. "It's from your grandmother," Ms. Vreeland said. "Your maternal grandmother, Ruth Marsh." The estate was located through the county records office. Callie had heard that name exactly once in her life said by her mother in a low voice during a phone call. Callie was not supposed to overhear in the kitchen of a rented duplex in a town she could no longer remember the name of. The call had not lasted long. Her mother's voice had gone tight and careful, and afterwards she had stood at the sink for a while with the water running and not said anything. Ruth Marsh, her grandmother. A woman who existed in Callie's life as nothing more than an absence with a name attached. She opened the envelope. Inside was a key in the folded document. The key was iron-heavy for its size, reddish with rust along the shaft. The kind of key that belonged to something old, something that had been locked for a long time. The document was a deed, the paper thick and slightly yellowed, the legal language dense and impenetrable to anyone who wasn't a county clerk. But the address was readable enough. A property in Harwick, Vermont. 1 acre of land. 1 barn. That was all. Callie looked up at Ms. Vreeland. A barn. Ms. Vreeland's expression did not change. "It's yours. The deed is in your name. The land transfers fully upon your 18th birthday. She paused. A piece of land is something, Callie. It's more than most. The way she said it carried a specific weight. Not cruelty, just the practiced compassion of someone who had learned to make small things sound significant, because small things were often all there was to offer. Callie looked at the key in her palm. It was cold. It was heavier than it should have been for its size. Or maybe that was just the feeling of holding something that had belonged to a stranger who was also by blood the closest thing to family she had left on this earth. She folded the deed and put it back in the envelope. She put the key in the front pocket of her jeans. Down the hall, she could hear the other kids getting breakfast. There was a boy named Marcus who had a talent for doing impressions of the night staff, and she could hear laughter coming from the direction of the kitchen. She thought about going to say goodbye. She thought about it for a few seconds, and then she picked up her canvas bag and walked out the front door instead. It wasn't coldness. It was just that goodbyes in places like Hargrove House had a particular shape, a shape that involved everyone knowing it was coming for months, and then pretending it was sudden and she didn't have the energy for the performance. She hoped Marcus and the others got somewhere decent. She hoped for it the way you hope for things you have no power over quietly without expectation. The November air hit her immediately, cold enough to make her eyes water, but not cold enough yet for snow. Though the sky had that particular flat white quality that meant snow was thinking about arriving. She zipped her jacket all the way to her chin and started walking toward the bus station 4 blocks away. She had a decision to make. She knew that. The bus voucher Ms. Vreeland had given her was open-ended any route within the state network. She could go to Burlington, she could go to Montpelier, she could go somewhere with actual job prospects and a shelter that took young adults and figure out the next step from there. That was the practical choice. That was the survivable choice. Or she could go to Harwick. She bought a coffee from a gas station on the corner, the kind that comes from a machine and tastes like the idea of coffee rather than actual coffee. And she stood outside the bus station and drank it while she looked at the deed again. She read the address twice. She looked at the key. A development company had included a letter with the probate documents. Ms. Vreeland had mentioned it briefly. Callie pulled it out of the envelope now. It was from something called Crane Group, printed on very expensive-looking paper, the letterhead embossed in navy blue. The letter was brief and polished and said almost nothing while saying everything. They were aware of the property transfer. They had a long-standing interest in the land. They were prepared to offer $5,000 for an immediate sale, all paperwork handled on their in-cash settlement within 72 hours. $5,000. To anyone who had grown up differently, that might have seemed like a small number. To Callie, standing outside a bus station in a town she was about to leave forever with $100 in her pocket and nowhere specific to go, $5,000 was a number that made her chest feel strange. It was enough to rent a room for 6 months. It was enough to eat without counting. It was enough to breathe. She folded the letter and put it in her pocket next to the key. Then she bought a ticket to Harwick. She told herself it was curiosity. She told herself she would go see what a 1-acre piece of land with a barn on it actually looked like in person, find whatever local real estate outfit handled these things, and sign whatever needed signing. A day, maybe 2. Then she would take the money and go somewhere that made sense. She told herself that on the bus and mostly believed it. The ride north took 4 hours. The landscape changed gradually, and then all at once, the way things tend to change when you're not watching closely enough. Strip malls and gas stations gave way to smaller towns. Smaller towns gave way to farmland, and farmland eventually gave way to forest, dense and dark and indifferent to the road cutting through it. The trees were bare now, their branches against the white sky like the fine cracks in old porcelain, pretty, in a way that had nothing to do with comfort. She slept for a while. When she woke up, snow was falling. Not heavy yet, just a preliminary suggestion of it, small flakes moving sideways in the wind, the kind that melts as soon as it touches something warm. But it was coming. She could see it in the way the light had flattened, the way the sky had lowered itself toward the tree line, like it had somewhere to be. The bus stopped twice before Harwick, once at a junction with a single gas station, and once at a larger town where three other passengers got off. By the time the driver announced Harwick, Callie was the only one left on the bus. The depot was a small building with a single wooden bench out front, its paint long since surrendered to the weather. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Harwick Transit, with a phone number that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 90s. A larger sign at the edge of the parking lot, the kind made of carved wood that towns like this used to signal their identity to passing strangers, read Harwick, Vermont. Population 490. Established 1847. The bus doors opened. Cold air rushed in, serious cold, the kind with intention behind it. Callie pulled on her backpack and stepped down onto the pavement. The bus pulled away. She stood and watched it go, its taillights red in the gray afternoon. And then she was alone in the parking lot of a bus depot in a town she had never been to, with a canvas bag and $100 and a key that opened something she hadn't seen yet. She started walking. Harwick's main street was 3 blocks long. She counted 4 businesses still operating: a hardware store, a post office, a small diner with lights on inside, and a handwritten specials board in the window, and a general store at the far end with a wooden sign above the door that read, Greer's Provisions Estine, 1962. There were a few other buildings, their windows dark, their facades suggesting purposes they had long since abandoned. Between them and the forest pressing in on all sides, the town felt less like a place and more like a determination, a decision someone had made a long time ago to stay somewhere and then kept renewing out of stubbornness or love or simple absence of anywhere else to go. The snow was picking up. She pushed open the door to Greer's Provisions. A bell announced her. The warmth inside hit her immediately, the particular warmth of a wood stove actually burning, not just a thermostat set to 68. The store was small and deep shelves running to the ceiling. Everything slightly crowded the arrangement of a place that had been adding stock for decades without removing anything. It smelled of sawdust and coffee and something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. Behind the counter at the far end, a man looked up from a newspaper. He was old in the way that certain Vermont winters make a person old, not worn down, but worn in the way good wood weathers. Thick white hair cut short, a face that had spent considerable time outdoors and made its peace with that. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt and suspenders, and he was looking at her over the top of a pair of reading glasses with an expression she couldn't immediately read. It wasn't unfriendly, it was watchful. "You're not from here," he said. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was an observation delivered with the confidence of someone who had lived in a town of 490 people long enough to know every face in it by memory. "No," Callie said. She stepped further into the store, letting the door close behind her. The warmth was getting into her fingers now, and she hadn't realized until that moment how cold she had gotten on the walk from the depot. "I'm looking for a property," she said. She pulled the deed from her envelope and held it up. "Ruth Marsh's place. I'm trying to find out how to get there." The man behind the counter went still. It was subtle. Anyone not paying attention would have missed it. But Callie had spent 2 years in an environment where reading the room was a survival skill, where the shift in someone's posture or the change in their breathing told you things their words wouldn't. She saw it. The newspaper lowered. The reading glasses came off. And something moved through the man's expression, something that started as recognition and arrived somewhere closer to grief. He came around the counter slowly. "You've got Ruth's jaw," he said. The words landed oddly. Callie didn't know what to do with them. She wasn't used to being looked at and seen as a continuation of something. She was used to being the end of a line. The man extended his hand. "Silas Greer. I've run this store since before you were born." He paused. "Your grandmother was a customer here for 40 years. I knew her well." He said it simply without embellishment. The way people talk about someone when the loss is still recent enough to require careful handling. "She passed earlier this year," he said. "May, just before the ground thawed." Callie nodded. She wanted to say something appropriate, but the truth was she didn't know how to grieve someone she had never met. She felt something when he said it, some movement of emotion that she couldn't name precisely, but it didn't feel like loss, not exactly. It felt more like the recognition of a loss that had happened before she had the chance to prevent it. I only found out about her when I got the deed, Callie said. She couldn't contact me. The foster system, I mean. I don't know if she tried. She tried, Silas said quietly. He said it with a certainty that told her there was more behind it, a longer story, and that he was choosing for the moment to leave most of it unspoken. He put a ceramic mug of coffee on the counter and gestured for her to take it. She wrapped both hands around it. You drove up from— She named the town where Hargrove House was. He nodded slowly. Long way, he said. You come to sell or you come to see? She hesitated. Honestly, I don't know yet. He seemed to respect that answer. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You know about the crane offer? She pulled the letter from her pocket and set it on the counter between them. He looked at it without touching it. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. $5,000, he said. That's what they're offering you. That's what the letter says. Silas was quiet for a moment. He picked up the letter, read it carefully, folded it along its existing creases, and set it back down. Ruth was offered $300,000, he said. The number arrived in the warm air of the store and sat there. Callie looked at him. $300,000. Cash offer, Silas said. 4 years ago, Crane Group sent a man up here in a car that cost more than most people in this town make in 5 years. Had the paperwork drawn up and everything. Ruth read it at this very counter. He paused. Then she handed it back to him and told him to get off her property and not come back. Callie was quiet. She looked at the Crane letter again, at the $5,000 offer printed on the expensive paper in the confident font of people who believe their own authority. They're offering me 1.6 cents on the dollar, she said slowly. That's right. Why would they do that? He met her eyes. Because they think you don't know what you've got. She thought about that for a moment. The bell above the door announced a cold rush of air, and both of them looked up. A man came in. He was not from Harwick. That much was immediately apparent. He wore a coat that cost more than it needed to charcoal wool. Perfectly fitted a town like this, would have called it Sunday clothes, except that nobody here would have owned something quite so deliberately polished. His shoes were leather, the wrong kind for snow, and his hair was cut with the precision of someone who visited a stylist rather than a barber. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, and he moved through the door of Greer's Provisions with the particular ease of a man who had learned to make every room feel like it was already expecting him. He looked at Silas, then he looked at Callie, at the deed still on the counter, at the Crane letter beside it. He smiled. The smile reached his mouth and not very far beyond it. Miss Marsh, he said, I thought that might be you. He extended a hand. Dex Pruitt. I'm a representative with Crane Group. We sent you a letter. He glanced at the envelope on the counter. Looks like you got it. She didn't take his hand. He let it fall smoothly, no flicker of reaction. I wanted to personally welcome you to Harwick, he continued, moving around so the counter was no longer between them, placing himself closer than necessary. And to let you know that our offer is still on the table. Simple transaction. Clean. You sign the paperwork, we handle everything else, and you walk away with $5,000 in your account by Friday. He tilted his head slightly. That's real money, Miss Marsh. And that property, I have to be honest with you, it's a liability. There's significant structural damage to the barn. The land itself hasn't been maintained. It would cost you more than it's worth just to bring it up to code. He delivered all of this in the smooth, measured tone of a man who had practiced it. Callie looked at him. Then she looked at Silas. Silas's expression had gone flat and careful, the face of a man who had seen this performance before and found it neither impressive nor original. The girl just arrived, Silas said. Give her a minute to breathe, Dex. Pruitt's smile didn't change. Of course. He reached into his coat and produced a business card, set it on the counter with a small click. Just giving her options. He looked at Callie. It's the smart play, Miss Marsh. Crane Group can take this off your hands before you've spent a dime on it. Think about it tonight. I'll be in town through the weekend. He gave a brief nod to Silas, turned, and walked out. The bell announced his exit. The door closed. The silence settled back in like water finding its level. Callie picked up his business card. She turned it over, turned it back. "He's been in town for 2 days," Silas said, waiting for the bus. He knew I was coming. They knew the probate transfer went through. She set the card down. She thought about what Silas had told her. $300,000 refused, and now they were offering 5. The gap between those two numbers had a shape to it that she didn't like. And Pruitt, with his leather shoes and his practiced smile, had been waiting at the bus depot before she even had a name for this town. That kind of readiness didn't come from casual interest. It came from urgency, from need. She looked out the window at the falling snow, at the street of the small town her grandmother had lived in for apparently long enough to become someone people mentioned with that particular quiet respect. "Can you take me out there?" she asked. "To the property." He was already reaching for his coat. The drive took 10 minutes on roads that became progressively narrower and less forgiving as they moved away from the main street. Silas drove a truck that was old enough to have opinions about certain grades and willing to share them. The heater worked, but only if you didn't ask too much of it. The windshield wipers beat a slow rhythm against the snow that was falling more steadily now, the light fading from gray to something darker at the edges. "She didn't know much about you," Silas said as he drove. "At least not in so many words. But she talked about you. Not often, and not in a way that was easy to listen to." "What do you mean?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I mean, she carried it," he said. "Whatever happened, whatever kept her from being in your life, she carried it with her everywhere she went, and she didn't put it down, not once that I ever saw." He paused. "She used to look at my granddaughter sometimes when she'd come into the store after school, and there'd be this expression she'd get. Not sad exactly, more like she was doing a calculation of all the years." Callie looked out the window at the dark shapes of the trees moving past. She turned onto Ridge Road. The pavement disappeared under a smooth layer of unplowed snow, and the truck moved more carefully. The forest came in close on both sides, old pines and birch, their branches weighted and still. The road narrowed further until it felt less like a road and more like a suggestion pressed between walls of trees. She came around a bend, and then Callie saw it. She had been trying on the bus and in the store and in the truck to manage her expectations down to a reasonable floor. "It's a barn," she had told herself. "Old and probably half collapsed. Nothing." But somehow, even knowing that, even intending for it not to matter, the sight of it made something catch in her chest. It was set back from the road, standing in a wide clearing that had once been kept, but was now returning slowly to the preferences of the land. Snow covered the clearing in an unbroken sheet, blue-white in the failing light. The barn itself was large, larger than she had imagined, its gray wood the color of old pewter. The roof sagged at the center, a long, curved depression, like a breath held too long. One of the main doors hung at an angle from a hinge that had given up, and the wood around the foundation was dark with age and weather, and years of seasons doing what seasons do to things left standing in them. It looked like something that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. Not a building anymore, but a feature of the place, like the tree line or the hills behind it. It was not beautiful, but it was something. It had the quality of things that have endured a kind of mute, battered authority. "This is it," Silas said. He put the truck in park and looked at her. He didn't say "home sweet home" because he was a man with enough sense to know when a phrase would land wrong. He just looked. "You all right?" She nodded once. "My number's on the store door," he said. "Day or night." He meant it. She could tell. "You find anything you don't understand, you call me. You feel uncomfortable out here alone, you call me." He looked at the barn, then back at her. "Ruth wouldn't have wanted you freezing. There are blankets in the supply room at the back if they haven't gone to rot." He hesitated. She kept the place clean even at the end. Best she could. Callie opened the truck door. The cold came in at once, total and immediate. "Thank you," she said. He waited in the truck engine idling while she crossed the clearing. Her feet broke through the surface crust of the snow with each step, the sound of it sharp and regular in the quiet. The clouds had lowered further. The snow fell without wind, now straight down, and the world had gone to near silence the way it only does in winter, that peculiar acoustic of snow, the way it swallows sound and replaces it with a stillness that has texture to it. She reached the side door, the smaller one, the one still on its hinges. The lock was stiff. She could feel the rust in it through the key, some resistance that went beyond simple disuse. She held her breath and turned. There was a moment of nothing. Then the mechanism gave way all at once with a sound like a word being pronounced. After a long silence, a grinding metallic release, and the door swung inward. The air that came out was cold in a different way than the outside cold. It was the cold of enclosed spaces, still and old and dense, with the accumulated time of a place that hadn't been disturbed. And beneath it fainter something else. Old wood and dried hay, and something she didn't have a name for, something that might have been the smell of someone's life, lived in a place for long enough that the place itself remembered them. She stepped inside. Behind her, she heard Silas put the truck in reverse. She didn't turn around. She heard him back down the road, and then the sound of the engine faded, and then there was nothing but the barn and the dark and the stillness. She pulled the small flashlight from her keychain. Its beam was narrow and weak, a pencil of yellow light against the absolute dark of the interior, and for a moment she just stood at the threshold and let it sweep slowly across what she could see. The barn was larger inside than it looked from the road. The ceiling rose into rafters. She couldn't quite make out the shadows up there, impenetrable. The air carried a quality of height that the beam couldn't fully account for. To her left, wooden stalls, their gates weathered to the same pewter gray as the exterior walls. To her right, shapes under canvas tarps, the outlines of equipment and lumber, and things she couldn't identify, piled or stacked with varying degrees of organization. The floor was packed earth hard as concrete from years of compaction. And straight ahead at the far end of the building, walled off from the rest, with a separate structure built into the barn's far corner, was a small room. Its door was open. Visible from where she stood just inside the larger space was a workbench. She moved toward it, slowly running the flashlight beam over the walls and floor as she went. She stopped at the covered shapes along the right side, lifted one tarp. An old tractor, red paint faded almost to nothing. Tires flat and cracked. It looked like something from a photograph rather than a thing that had ever actually worked. She kept walking. The stalls were empty. Some dry straw in one corner, brittle as paper. A rusted hinge on a gate. A nail pulled halfway from a post, something that had once hung from it, long since gone. She reached the workbench. It stopped her. Not the bench itself, which was old and scarred and nothing remarkable, but the way it was kept. In the middle of a building that showed its years in every surface, the workbench was ordered with a precision that stood apart from everything around it. Tools hung on a pegboard above the work surface, each one on its own hook, their outlines traced in white paint so you could see at a glance what was missing. Wrenches in descending size, hammers at the far right, a row of hand tools along the bottom. Below the pegboard, on a long shelf, glass jars were arranged in a sequence that went from largest to smallest, each one filled with hardware screws or nails or bolts, and each one labeled in a script that was small and careful and legible. The handwriting was unlike any she had ever had reason to think about before. It was the handwriting of someone who had taken care with it, who had understood that legibility was a form of consideration for whoever came after. She stood in front of the workbench and looked at it for a long time. The flashlight beam went still. Ruth had stood here. Her hands had organized these tools. Her handwriting was on those labels. The care she had taken with this small space in a large aging building said something about her that Callie couldn't yet fully read, but could feel in the way you feel meaning before you have language for it. She moved the light along the shelf, past the jars toward the far end where a slight shadow behind the last container suggested something was pushed back against the wall. She reached over, moved the jar. Behind it, small and unremarkable, was a tin box. She knew immediately that it was intentional, not left and forgotten, but placed. The way the jars had been arranged, the way the box was set back exactly far enough to be invisible from casual distance, but visible if you were looking carefully, It was the same quality of deliberateness that ran through everything in this workspace. She lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a folded square of yellowed cotton, were two items. The first was a photograph. Black and white, its edges curled with age, the surface carrying the particular softness of old prints. It showed a young woman, dark hair, a face that held something behind its expression, something careful and private and fully alive. She was standing outdoors, squinting slightly in what looked like summer light. She was holding a baby against her chest, and the way she held the baby both arms, no casual arrangement, but the full protective enclosure of someone who understands that they are holding something irreplaceable, said everything. Callie turned the photograph over. On the back, in that same careful script, Ruth and Diane. Summer 1985. Her mother. As a baby. Held by the woman who was now holding Callie's inheritance in the form of a key and a deed in this carefully ordered workbench in an old barn in Vermont. She held the photograph for a long time. The flashlight trembled slightly in her other hand. She had carried the blurry snapshot of her mother laughing in the yellow kitchen for 2 years, had looked at it so many times the edges had gone soft from handling. But this was different. This was her mother before any of it. Before the moves and the silences and the man with fire in his eyes. Before everything that had happened and could not be undone. This was her mother held in someone's arms and loved so plainly that the love was still visible in the black and white grain of an old photograph decades later. The second item was a folded piece of paper newer than the photograph, the fold clean and deliberate. She opened it. The writing filled the small page in that familiar hand. She had never seen this writing before today, and yet it already felt known to her in the way that things feel known when they turn out to be what you were missing. The note read, "The heart of the house is not in the house. It's where the work is done. Trust the grain. Find what is built to last. And when you find it, understand that everything else was to protect this." She read it 3 times. Then she read it a fourth. The heart of the house is not in the house. She was standing in the barn. There was no house. This was the heart. This workbench, this room, this carefully organized space in a building that was everything Ruth Marsh had left in the world. Trust the grain. She looked at the workbench again. The top was oak thick planks joined together, the grain flowing across the surface in dark and light lines that had accumulated over decades. She moved the flashlight slowly across it, ran her fingers along the surface, feeling for irregularities, for anything that didn't belong to the natural character of the wood. Nothing on top. She moved to the front of the bench. Drawers. She pulled them open one by one, the wood swollen from years of temperature changes, each one requiring a particular angle to coax free. More tools. Coils of wire. Spare fittings. All organized, all in their place, all ordinary. She crouched and looked at the legs. 4 legs each, a solid post of wood. Except one. The leg at the near left corner was constructed differently from the others. Where the others were single pieces, this one appeared to be composed of several sections laminated together, the seams visible if you were looking for them. And along one side, the grain didn't match. The lines ran at a different angle, not dramatically, not in a way that would catch the eye from a distance, but wrong in a way that was undeniable once you were close enough to see it. Her pulse shifted. She ran her fingers along the seam. No obvious latch, no button. She pressed. Nothing. She pressed along different sections of the panel. Nothing. She was about to stand up when she saw it. A knot in the wood. Small, slightly darker than the surrounding grain, positioned near the center of the mismatched panel. It was the right size for a thumb. She pressed it. A sound. Small, mechanical, the particular click of something releasing that has been waiting patiently for exactly this. The panel moved, just slightly an inch inward, and then stopping the way a cabinet door shifts when its latch lets go. She worked her fingers into the gap at the edge and pulled. The section of the leg came free on a hinge, swinging outward to reveal a cavity carved into the solid interior of the post. Deep, dark, large enough to hold something of significance. She reached in. Her fingers found smooth leather, cool to the touch. She closed her hand around it and pulled it out carefully as if speed might break it. It was a journal. Hard bound in dark brown leather, the cover worn at the corners, the spine soft from handling. A thin strap of leather was wrapped around it twice and fastened with a simple brass catch. Not locked, just kept. She held it in both hands. The flashlight was failing now, its battery giving up its last reserves. She turned it off to save what remained. In the darkness of the barn, with the sound of snow against the wooden walls, and the cold settling deeper into the building around her, she undid the strap with careful fingers and opened the journal to the first page. The beam of the flashlight, activated one more time, found the page. At the top, in Ruth's handwriting, clear and careful as everything else, she had left behind the date. And below the date, two words that stopped Callie's breath. My Diane. Not dear Diane, not a greeting, just the claim of it, the possession and the love of it. My little bird, my Diane. You came into the world on a Tuesday morning when the maple outside this window was just starting to turn, and I didn't know until that moment what I had been living for. Holding you, I understood everything that had come before as practice. Every difficulty, every ordinary day had been preparation for being the person who would hold you. Callie stopped reading. She sat on the frozen earth floor of the barn, the journal open in her lap and the flashlight dimming in her hand, and she did something she hadn't done in a very long time. She cried. Not loudly, not with the full volume of it, which was considerable, just quietly in the dark, in the particular private way of someone who has spent years learning to keep things interior. The tears came and she let them because this moment required honesty. She was holding the first evidence she had ever encountered that her mother had been loved from the beginning, that there was someone who had watched her arrive in the world and understood her value completely and immediately and without condition. She had not known until this moment how much she needed to know that. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. She breathed. She looked at the journal, and then at the workbench, and then at the hatch in the leg still hanging open, its dark interior now empty. Her grandmother had left her something. Not a barn, not a piece of land, something she had hidden and protected and kept for exactly the right person to find. She didn't know yet what the rest of it meant. She didn't know about the quarry, or the water, or the ledger, or the photographs taken in the dark. She didn't know about the second hiding place, or the safe buried under stone, or the evidence that could bring down a man who had spent 20 years making himself untouchable. She only knew that she had been carrying an iron key across the state of Vermont for 3 days, and she had finally found the door it opened. She pulled her wool sweater tighter and began to read. 40 feet away on the unplowed road at the edge of the tree line, a black SUV sat with its engine off and its lights dark. The snow fell on its roof and hood without accumulating much, the metal still warm from a long drive. Inside, barely visible through the frosted glass, the glow of a phone screen illuminated a face for a moment and then went dark. Dex Pruitt watched the faint wavering light visible through the gaps in the barn's old boards. He watched it go still. He watched it stay there. He picked up his phone and typed a message. She went inside. She's been in there over an hour. The reply came in under a minute. Let her look. There's nothing there she can use. Just make sure she takes the money. Pruitt set the phone on the passenger seat. He looked at the barn. He had been inside that building before. 6 months ago, the week after Ruth Marsh was buried, he had driven up Ridge Road in the dark and let himself in through the window on the east side that had a loose latch and had searched it for 3 hours. He had found the workbench. He had seen the leg with the mismatched grain. He had pressed every surface and found nothing. Whatever the mechanism was, he had not found it. He had concluded either that he was wrong about the bench or that the compartment, if it existed, was empty. He had reported back to Crane that the property was clean. He was less certain of that conclusion now. He did not look concerned. He looked like a man running a revised calculation. The snow kept falling. Inside the barn, Callie Marsh kept reading. And somewhere in the pages of that journal, without knowing it yet, she was finding out exactly how wrong they all were. The journal was not a small thing. It ran to several hundred pages, the entries sometimes long and sometimes brief, The handwriting consistent across decades in the way that handwriting becomes when a person commits to a particular way of forming their letters young and never sees a reason to change. Ruth Marsh had written in this book the way some people pray regularly and honestly and without expectation of an audience. Callie read through the night. She had found the blanket Silas mentioned in a wooden trunk in the small back room wall, and heavy and smelling of cedar and thyme. She wrapped herself in two of them and sat on the trunk with the journal in her lap and the flashlight propped against a jar on the workbench shelf so its beam fell at an angle across the pages. The battery was dying. She read faster. The early entries were about Diane. Pages and pages of Diane. First words and first steps, and the funny way she refused to eat anything orange for an entire year, and then one day decided carrots were acceptable and never mentioned the previous position again. Ruth wrote about her daughter with the particular attention of someone who understands that time moves in one direction and wants to catch as much of it as possible before it goes. She wrote about afternoons in the garden and trips to the hardware store in town, and a summer when Diane decided she was going to learn to identify every bird in Vermont by its call, and spent 3 months with a field guide and a notebook before abandoning the project in favor of something else that was never specified. Callie read these sections slowly. She was not a character in them. Her mother was a child, then a teenager, then a young woman, and Callie observed all of it from a distance of decades and circumstance, a stranger watching through glass. But it was not a painful distance. It was the distance of receiving something you did not know existed, the kind of receiving that requires you to sit still and be careful with it. She was watching her mother live, watching her grow up loved and specific and real in a way that the blurry photograph in the yellow kitchen had never quite managed to convey. Ruth had given her daughter back to her in these pages, and Callie sat in the cold and received her page by page, year by year. And then, approximately a third of the way through the journal, a name appeared for the first time. Jack Marsh. Ruth's first entry about him was brief. 3 sentences. Diane brought a young man to Sunday dinner. His name is Jack Marsh. He has fire in his eyes, the kind you notice before you've decided what you think of it. Callie stopped on that line. Read it again. She had known her father as a presence, specifically as a large and unpredictable one. She had memories of his voice, deep and capable of filling a room in ways that had nothing to do with volume. She had memories of her mother's posture changing when his truck pulled into the driveway, a shift that was nearly imperceptible, but absolute the way an animal adjusts to a change in the weather. She had memories of a specific quality of silence that filled their rented houses, a silence that had weight and direction, a silence that meant something was being carefully avoided. She had not known before this night that anyone had watched him arrive in their family's story from the outside and written down what they saw. She read on. Ruth's entries about Jack over the following months were careful. They were the entries of a woman who loved her daughter enough to go slowly to resist the conclusion her instincts were already drawing. She noted his charm, which was real, the way real charm always is specific and attentive, the kind that makes you feel like the most important person in a room. She noted Diane's happiness, which was also real. She noted the way Jack and Diane fit together in the early months, the ease of it, and she tried to believe that ease. But Ruth Marsh was a woman who paid attention to small things. She always had been. She wrote about a dinner where Jack interrupted Diane 3 times in 20 minutes, and each time Diane's sentence trailed off and did not resume. She wrote about a 4th of July when Jack arrived 2 hours late, and the quality of the apology he offered, which was elaborate, and ultimately redirected the conversation to his own inconvenience in a way so smooth you almost didn't notice it happening. She wrote about a comment he made about Diane's friends, the way he referred to them as a waste of her time, and the specific expression on Diane's face when he said it, an expression Ruth described as a door closing from the inside. He has fire in his eyes. She had written that the first night. By the end of the second year, she had completed the sentence. The kind that burns, she wrote. Not the kind that warms. I know the difference now. I wish I had been wrong. Callie sat in the cold of the barn and read her father's history as witnessed by the woman who had tried to protect her mother from it. She read about the slow narrowing of Diane's world, the friends who stopped being mentioned in letters, the family dinners that became infrequent, and then stopped the moves from one town to another, that Jack always framed as opportunity, and Ruth increasingly recognized as something else. She read about the phone calls that went unanswered, and the letters that came back unopened, and the specific, particular cruelty of watching someone you love disappear into a life they chose and cannot see the shape of from inside it. She read about herself. Diane is pregnant. She called me this morning, her voice doing that thing it does now where she sounds like she's reading from a script. She's memorized everything a little too, even a little too flat. She's happy about the baby, she says. Jack is happy. She says the word happy the way people say fine when they mean something else entirely. I told her I was glad, and I kept my voice steady. After we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I think about that child. I think about what it means to be born into a story already in progress, to arrive without context, to be handed the middle of something without the beginning. I want that child to know they are wanted. I want them to know that whatever is happening around them does not define what they deserve. I have to do something. I just don't know yet what something looks like from here. Callie set the journal down on her knee. She looked at the wall of the barn, at the gray weathered wood, at the snow she could hear but not see pressing against the other side of it. She thought about being born into a story already in progress. She thought about all the ways she had felt in 16 years of living, in 2 years of the system, that she had arrived somewhere mid-sentence and never found the beginning. Her grandmother had known, had seen it coming before Callie existed, had wanted to change it and had not been able to. She picked up the journal and kept reading. The next section was harder. It covered a period of approximately 14 months, and in it Ruth documented the accident on Route 9, the winter road, the truck that crossed the center line. She had received the news by phone from a county official reading from a form. She wrote about that call in the flat, factual language of someone who has been hollowed out by something and is recording the details because the details are the only thing left to hold. Jack and Diane were gone. Callie was 16, and Ruth had driven to the county office the following week and filed for emergency custody. Callie did not know this. She had never known this. No one in the system had ever mentioned it. She read the entries that followed with a cold settling into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature of the barn. Ruth had retained a lawyer, a local man named Gerald Holt. She had submitted financial documentation, character references from half a dozen people in Harwick, a detailed account of her property and her capacity to provide a stable environment for her granddaughter. She had done everything correctly and completely, and with a speed that suggested she had been thinking about this possibility for longer than it had been necessary to think about it. And then the process had stopped. Not through any official denial, not through a finding against Ruth, but through a series of delays and complications and additional requirements that accumulated over weeks and then months in a pattern that Ruth began to recognize as intentional. A request for additional documentation, a referral to a different county office, a reassessment order that required a third-party evaluation of Ruth's mental fitness to raise a child, the evaluation to be conducted by an assessor appointed by the county. The assessor's report had found Ruth Marsh to be, in its language, an isolated and potentially unstable individual whose limited social engagement and unconventional lifestyle represented a risk factor in the placement of a minor. Ruth's entry the day she received that report was one of the shortest in the entire journal. 4 words followed by a name. "This is Victor Crane." Callie read the sentence and then read it again and then sat very still. Ruth had taken 2 pages to explain what she meant, the handwriting smaller and more controlled than usual, the writing of someone pressing down hard on something that wanted to move faster. She had pieced it together over weeks. Victor Crane was the founder and principal of Crane Group, a real estate development company operating across 3 states in the Northeast, headquartered in Burlington. He had been interested in Ruth's property for years, the acre and the barn, and the well beneath it, which sat at the geological intersection of 2 aquifers and produced water of a quality and volume that had no comparison within a 5-mile radius. He had made his first offer 4 years before the accident. Ruth had declined. He had made a second offer larger with a representative who was polite and then less polite. She had declined again. He had sent Dex Pruitt the third time. After that third refusal, Crane had changed his approach. He was a man with resources and patience and a particular understanding of how systems worked when you knew the people running them. He had a relationship with two members of the County Child Welfare Oversight Board. One of them had been a business partner in an early Crane Group project. The other had received a significant personal loan several years prior under terms that had never been formally documented. The assessor who had found Ruth mentally unsuitable had been brought in from outside the county specifically for this case, appointed on the recommendation of the board member who owed Crane a debt. The assessor had visited Ruth's property once for 40 minutes and had written a report of 3 pages that was decisive and entirely inaccurate. Callie was 16 years old when this happened. She had spent the following 2 years in the foster system because a man who wanted to buy a piece of land had arranged it that way. He knew she would age out, Ruth had written. He knew that at 18 she would be released from the system with nothing, no family, no resources, no understanding of what she owned. He knows that a girl in that position will take $5,000 and sign anything put in front of her. He has been waiting 2 years for that girl to turn 18. I am not going to let him have it. Callie sat for a long time without moving. The cold in the barn had reached a depth that was no longer ignorable. Her feet were numb. Her hands holding the journal were stiff. The flashlight beam had gone yellow and dimmed the battery near its end. She was aware of all of this distantly, the way you are aware of physical sensation when something more fundamental has your full attention. She was thinking about the letter in her pocket. The Crane Group offer on the expensive paper. $5,000 clean, simple, handled by Friday. She was thinking about Dex Pruitt in his tailored coat, in the warmth of Greer's provisions, extending a hand she hadn't taken. About the way he had looked at the deed on the counter. About the fact that he had been in town for 2 days before she arrived. He had not been waiting out of professional courtesy. He had been waiting because every day she didn't sign was a day the evidence remained in whatever location Ruth had chosen for it, and he did not know where that was. She had underestimated the urgency. She saw it now clearly with the journal in her lap and 2 years of arranged loneliness behind her. This was not a business transaction that could have gone the other way. This was a trap that had been built around her life before she was old enough to understand she was inside it. She looked at the journal. She looked at the workbench. Ruth had not been finished. She turned to the later entries, the ones written in the months, and then the final weeks of her grandmother's life. The handwriting showing age in its slight tremor, but losing none of its precision. And what she found there changed the shape of everything again. Ruth had used the 2 years she could not get to Callie to do something else. She had begun to watch Crane. It had started with the trucks. Harwick sat at the northern edge of Crane Group's operational territory, and Ridge Road was not a route anyone traveled without reason. It dead-ended at the quarry less than a mile past Ruth's property. But over a period of weeks, Ruth had noticed a pattern, certain nights, certain hours. Trucks with Crane Group markings moving down Ridge Road and not returning until well after midnight. She had noted dates and times in the margins of the journal. Then she had followed them. She was in her mid-70s and alone, and she drove a truck with a loose belt that occasionally squealed in the cold, and she had followed Crane Group vehicles down a forest road in the dark of Vermont winter nights more times than Callie could count from the entries. She had parked where she could not be seen. She had walked through snow with a camera she'd ordered from a catalog old but functional, and she had photographed what she found at the quarry. The quarry had been officially decommissioned 8 years prior. According to county records, it was idle, a remediation pending site with environmental compliance obligations that Crane Group had assumed as part of a real estate transaction. According to Ruth's photographs, none of which Callie had seen yet, but which the entries described in precise detail, it was a functioning illegal disposal site. Crane Group was contracting with industrial facilities in 3 states to accept chemical waste at below-market rates and dumping it in the quarry's lower excavation pits, which communicated directly with the regional water table. Ruth had taken the photographs. She had also taken water samples, 10 of them, over 14 months drawn from her own well and from two other locations she identified in the entries. She had sent the samples to a private laboratory in Massachusetts under a name other than her own, paying cash, receiving results that she transcribed into the journal in columns that were precise as the hardware labels on her shelf. The water downstream from the quarry was compromised. The contamination was measurable and moving. It would reach the town's primary water source within 3 to 5 years if nothing changed. Ruth's well, due to its position and geology, was unaffected. It sat upstream of the contamination, elevated above it, protected by the particular shape of the land. That was what Crane wanted. Not the barn, not the acre, the well, the last clean water source in the area. He wanted to acquire it, cap it, claim it, and then when the contamination he was accelerating made the town's existing water supply unusable, he wanted to sell the cleanup contract to the state and manage the entire remediation process. The numbers Ruth had calculated from publicly available contracting data were in the range of $12 to $15 million over 10 years. $5,000 to acquire the one piece of land that made the whole scheme work. Callie stood up. She did not decide to stand. Her body simply did it. She walked to the center of the barn floor and stood there in the diminishing light and breathed. She looked at the walls, at the tools, at the careful order of the workbench in the middle of all the age and decay. She thought about an old woman driving alone in winter darkness to photograph illegal dumping. She thought about water samples sent under a false name, paid for in cash, received and transcribed by a woman in her 70s who understood that evidence requires custody and specificity. She thought about a journal hidden in a bench leg and a note that said, "Trust the grain." Ruth had not left her a barn. Ruth had left her a case. She turned back to the final pages. The last section of the journal covered 6 weeks, and it was different from everything that came before it. The entries were shorter, more urgent, the handwriting showing effort. Ruth had known she was running out of time, not from any dramatic cause, but from the ordinary accumulation of years and the failure of a body that had worked hard for decades and was nearing its limit. She had used those weeks deliberately. "There is a man in town, a lawyer named Fletcher Amos," Ruth had written. "His father and I were friends for 30 years. Fletcher is not his father. He is younger and more cautious, but he is honest, which is the rarer quality and the more important one. I have spoken to him. I have told him enough to understand what is at stake, not everything, but enough. He knows you will come. He knows your name. He has agreed to help. He does not know where the evidence is. I have not told him. The fewer people who know, the longer it stays safe. Callie, I need you to do something I have no right to ask of you. I need you to understand what is here and then decide what you want to do with it. I have left you 2 things inside the safe below this floor. One of them is money. It is every dollar I saved in the last 6 years, selling what I could sell and keeping what I needed to keep. It is $50,000. It is not a fortune, but it is a beginning. It is enough to go somewhere and start. The other thing is the evidence, all of it. Photographs, water test results, a ledger I have assembled of Crane's loan operation, which he runs through a shell company registered in Delaware, the victims of which include most of the families in this county who ever needed money in the last 15 years and made the mistake of going to the wrong place for it. The ledger includes your father's name. I am not telling you this to hurt you. I am telling you because you deserve the complete picture. Callie stopped. She read that line again. Then she sat on the floor with the journal and let the words settle. Her father's name. In a ledger of victims. Jack Marsh, who had moved his family from town to town, who had borrowed money and could not repay it, who had become someone Crane could use. She had carried a simple story about her father for 2 years, that he was a difficult man, a controlling man, a man whose anger filled rooms. The truth was more complicated. He had been those things. He had also been trapped by the same machinery now trying to trap her. The understanding did not excuse anything, but it changed the shape of things. She kept reading. You can take the money and leave and never look back. I would not blame you for 1 second of any day. You have earned the right to simply live, and I do not want the weight of this fight to fall on you because you feel you have no other choice. You always have another choice. Please remember that. Or you can take the evidence to Fletcher Amos, and you can finish what I started. Whatever you choose, Callie, whatever you decide, I have loved you for 18 years from a distance that was not my choice and that I could not close, and I am sorry for every day of that distance, and I hope that what I have left you here is enough to show you that the distance was never indifference. It was always love. It was always only love. Callie closed the journal. She did not cry this time. She had moved through that and come out the other side of it into something quieter and colder and more resolved. She set the journal carefully on the workbench and looked at the back room, the stone floor. She picked up the pry bar from the hook where it hung, the largest one, its iron worn smooth from use, and walked to the back room with the flashlight in her other hand. The room was 10 feet by 10 feet. Stone floor, the flags irregular in size but laid with care, their surfaces worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. She walked the perimeter, first tapping the handle of the pry bar against each stone as she went, listening to the sound. Solid, solid, solid. She worked inward from the edges. Still solid. She was nearly at the center when she stopped. She crouched. She moved the flashlight close to the surface. Near the center of the room, one stone sat slightly lower than its neighbors. Not dramatically, not enough to catch a foot or draw the eye, but measurable. And on its near edge, worked into the stone with something sharp and patient, was a mark. Small, precise, the curved shape of a new moon. She looked at it for a long moment. The crescent was deliberate. It was the work of someone who knew that the person coming after them would be looking for exactly this kind of sign. Someone who trusted the person coming after them to look carefully enough to find it. She wedged the tip of the pry bar into the seam beside the marked stone and leaned. The iron creaked against the stone. Her boots slipped on the floor and she repositioned. She put her shoulder into it. She breathed. The stone didn't move and then moved suddenly and all at once, pivoting upward with a deep grinding sound of stone against packed earth, a sound that seemed too large for the small room. She got her fingers under the edge and lifted the flag, coming free and heavy, 50 pounds at least, and she set it aside on the floor and looked at what was underneath. A cavity in the earth, lined with sheet metal, the seams riveted, the whole thing sealed against moisture with a thoroughness that spoke of careful preparation. The cavity was perhaps 18 inches deep and 2 feet across. Inside it, a safe. Not large. A personal safe, the kind available at any hardware store, its black paint scratched and worn at the corners from handling. On top of the safe, a sealed envelope. Her name on the front. Callie. Just that. In Ruth's handwriting. She lifted the envelope out. Her hands were steadier than she expected them to be. She opened it and unfolded the pages inside and read them there, crouching on the stone floor of the back room, in the failing light of the flashlight, the cold absolute around her. It was all there. Everything the journal had described and more. The combination to the safe, which was a sequence of numbers she recognized after a moment as her mother's birthday. An explanation of the evidence inside, organized and detailed. The name and address of Fletcher Amos's office on Main Street in Harwick. A map drawn by hand showing Ridge Road and the quarry and the approximate locations where Ruth had taken her photographs. And at the end, the two choices laid out with the clear-eyed fairness of a woman who understood that she was asking something enormous and refused to dress it as anything less. Callie read the letter once. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. She set the combination on the safe and turned the dial. Right, left, right. The final number arrived with a click she could feel in her fingertips, and the bolts drew back and the door swung open. Inside, exactly as described. On the left side, a metal box, its lid fitting flush, the weight of it significant when she lifted it slightly to confirm. She set it back down. She did not open it. $50,000. The number was real to her in an abstract way, the way large numbers are real before you have held them. It was enough to begin somewhere else. It was the easier road made concrete and available. She looked at it for a moment, Then she moved her hand to the right side of the safe. A waterproof portfolio, the kind used for architectural drawings, sealed with a double zipper. She lifted it out. It was heavy in the way that truth is heavy not by volume, but by consequence. She was zipping it closed when she heard the door. Not the small side door she had come through, the main door, the one hanging crooked on its hinge. She heard it move the damaged hinge, giving its particular sound metal on metal, a sound she had heard when she arrived and cataloged without thinking about it. She was on her feet without deciding to be the portfolio under her left arm, pressed flat against her body, her right hand going to the flashlight and clicking it off in the same motion. The darkness came down complete. She did not move. Footsteps on packed earth, more than one set. She counted the weight of them, the pattern of two distinct gaits, one heavier than the other, both deliberate, both moving with the confidence of people who believe they are alone in a space. A flashlight beam, large and powerful, cutting across the barn from the direction of the main entrance. She tracked it through the gap in the back room's wall. Dex Pruitt's voice, low conversational, speaking to whoever was with him. The bench first. She pressed herself back into the corner of the back room behind the open door and stood absolutely still. Her breathing she controlled by an act of deliberate will, keeping it shallow and even, drawing air through her nose in a slow, continuous intake that made no sound. The beam of Pruitt's flashlight swept into the main barn. She watched it through the crack in the door frame, the light moving across the workbench, the pegboard, the labeled jars. She heard drawers being opened. She heard the sound of things moved and replaced, not recklessly but thoroughly, the movements of someone who knows what they are looking for and how to look for it. Pruitt had searched this bench before and not found the mechanism. He was searching it again because something had changed, because she had come inside and stayed. The beam swung toward the back room. She pressed deeper into the corner. The door was already open. They would look in. She had perhaps 4 seconds. She looked at the flagstone she had lifted set against the wall, at the cavity in the floor, at the safe inside it, its door open, the metal cash box visible. She took one step forward in the dark, moving entirely by the memory of where things were. She reached the safe. She eased the door closed. She did not have time to find the flagstone and cover it. The footsteps were too close, 2 seconds at most. She stepped back, pressed into the corner again, pulled the portfolio tighter against her body. The flashlight came through the door. Pruitt swept the beam across the room in a slow arc. Left wall, right wall, the floor, the cavity in the floor, the flagstone beside it, the safe. He went still. She watched the beam stop on the safe. She heard him take 2 steps into the room. She watched the light stay on the safe's door, which was closed, which showed nothing of what was inside. He crouched. She could see his shape in the reflected light, the dark shape of his coat. He reached for the safe door. He pulled it open. The beam fell inside. The cash box. No portfolio. He stayed crouched for a moment. She could not see his expression. She could see the set of his shoulders, and they told her he was calculating something. The safe had been opened. The combination had been used. The girl had been in this room, but the portfolio was not here. The other voice from outside the back room. Anything. Pruitt stood. He looked at the room again, the beam sweeping once more, slower this time. The beam crossed the corner where she was standing. She held everything. Every muscle, every breath, every instinct that wanted to move. She held it all in a complete stillness that she had learned in a dozen different group home situations and never needed more than in this moment. She had been invisible in crowded rooms before. She had been overlooked by people looking directly at her. She knew how to be less than what she was when that was what survival required. The beam moved on. Nothing here, Pruitt said. He sounded neither relieved nor convinced. He sounded like a man filing an absence as a data point rather than a conclusion. They left the back room. She listened to them move through the main barn, doing a slower sweep on the way out, the light touching the covered equipment and the stalls and the space above the rafters. She heard the main door move again, the hinge protesting. She heard the footsteps on the snow outside moving away. She heard eventually the sound of an engine. She stood in the dark for a long time after the engine sound faded. long enough to be certain, long enough for her heartbeat to come down from the high register it had been in and return to something workable. Then she bent and closed the safe and picked up the flagstone from where it leaned against the wall and lowered it back into place, fitting it down over the cavity, pressing until the seam matched its neighbors as closely as she could manage in the dark. She stood and looked at the room one more time, the small crescent mark on the stone just barely visible in the ambient darkness. She moved the flagstone 2 inches to the right so the mark faced the wall. No one finding it by accident would know where to look. She moved through the main barn without the flashlight navigating by the faint ambient light from the snow coming through the gaps in the walls, and she reached the side door and opened it slowly and stood at the threshold and listened. Wind in the pines, snow falling, silence where an engine had been. She went out. The cold hit her immediately total and serious, and she understood within the first 30 seconds that she was not dressed for this, that the walk back to town in this temperature was a genuine physical problem and not a minor inconvenience. Her jacket was wool and it was thin and it was not designed for a 3-mile walk in a Vermont night with the temperature somewhere in the teens and falling. She thought about the $50,000 in the safe. She thought about taking it, about what it would mean to be on a bus somewhere warmer by morning with money in her pocket and no one waiting for her and no obligation to anyone living or dead. She thought about Pruitt's flashlight beam crossing the corner where she stood. She thought about a woman in her 70s walking through snow in the dark with a mail-order camera to photograph illegal dumping night after night because she could not get to the person she most needed to protect. She went anyway. She took the tree line rather than the road, staying under the cover of the pines, her feet finding the snow that had drifted in under the branches, the surface irregular and difficult, every step requiring attention. She kept the portfolio under her jacket, pressed flat against her side, held in place by her left arm clamped to her body. It was the warmest thing she was doing. She walked fast, not running because running in this footing would mean falling, and she could not fall. She needed to be moving and upright and continuous until she reached the town lights, but as close to running as the terrain allowed. Her face went numb within the first 10 minutes. Her feet, already cold inside sneakers that had never been designed for winter in any meaningful sense, became distant and unreliable, communicating only in blunt signals of bad and worse. She thought about nothing except the next step and the step after that. This was something she knew how to do. Narrowing the world to what was immediately necessary, excluding everything peripheral moving through a problem, by refusing to look at its full dimensions all at once. The 3 miles was not 3 miles. It was the next footfall and then the one after. When the tree line gave way to open field, she crossed it quickly, exposed, keeping low, and then she was on the road that led back into Harwick, and the snow on the pavement was packed and easier to walk on, and the lights of the town were visible as a faint orange warmth at the edges of the darkness. She reached the main street at what she estimated was close to 5 in the morning. The town was completely still. No lights in windows, no movement, nothing. The snow had stopped sometime in the last hour, and the street was a pristine white, undisturbed, her own footprints, the only marks in it. She walked to the building she had noted in the afternoon, the one between the diner and the hardware store, the sign above the door reading Fletcher Amos, Attorney at Law, in small professional letters. The door had a mail slot and a buzzer and a small printed card in a holder that listed office hours beginning at 8:30. She pressed the buzzer. Nothing. She pressed it again and held it. 10 seconds. 15. A light came on upstairs. She stepped back and looked up. A window above the office. A shape behind the glass, difficult to read, then the shape moving. 2 minutes passed. The lock on the office door turned and the door opened and a man stood in the frame. He was in his 60s, the age estimated from his face, and the white at his temples rather than his posture, which was straight and alert despite the hour and the abruptness of his waking. He wore a wool robe over what appeared to be work clothes still half assembled, the collar of a flannel shirt visible at the neck. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that confirms what he has been quietly expecting for some time. His eyes went from her face to the portfolio visible at the edge of her jacket, to the snow on her shoulders and the ice beginning to form at the edges of her hair. She had not planned what to say. She said the thing that was truest. My name is Callie Marsh. Ruth Marsh was my grandmother. She said I could trust you. She took the portfolio out from under her jacket and held it out. Fletcher Amos looked at it for a moment. Then he took it from her hands. Then he stepped back from the doorway and held it open. Come in, he said. He said it quietly, the way you say something when the situation is larger than the words available for it, and you have decided to simply move forward. Come in and get warm. We have a great deal to talk about, and we should start before it gets light. She stepped inside, and he closed the door behind her and locked it, and the warmth of the building came over her all at once, and her hands, as the blood returned to them, began to ache with a pain that felt almost like relief. Fletcher Amos made coffee without asking if she wanted any. He simply filled the pot and set it going and pulled a chair close to the small electric heater in the corner of his office, and he gestured to it, and she sat, and neither of them spoke until the coffee was ready and the mugs were in their hands, and the heater had begun to make a meaningful difference in the temperature of the room. Then he opened the portfolio on his desk. He was methodical about it. He did not rush. He moved through the contents in the order they had been arranged, which was Ruth's order, and as he read, his expression changed in the small and controlled way of a man who has spent decades learning not to let his face get ahead of his judgment. But his hands slowed on certain pages. He held the water test results for a long time. He held the photographs longer. The photographs showed what they showed with a clarity that required no interpretation. When he finished, he set the portfolio down and looked at Callie across the desk with an expression that had moved fully past professional neutrality into something more unguarded. She did all of this alone, he said. Callie wrapped both hands around her mug. Over the last 2 years, mostly. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the portfolio again. I knew she was building something. She told me enough to know there was more she wasn't telling me, and I trusted her judgment on that. She was a careful woman. She was, Callie said. The word was came out before she could consider it, and she let it stand. Fletcher picked up one of the photographs, the one that showed a Crane Group truck at the quarry's lower entrance, the timestamp visible in the corner, the company logo clear on the door panel. He set it down precisely where it had been. Here's what I can do, he said. He said it like the beginning of a list, like a man who organizes his thoughts in the sequential order of necessary actions. I can file for an emergency injunction on the quarry site within 24 hours. Environmental contamination with documented evidence of ongoing harm, a federal judge can issue a stop work order faster than Crane's lawyers can arrange a response. Simultaneously, I can transmit copies of this evidence to the EPA regional office in Boston and to the FBI field office in Burlington. Both of those channels operate independently of county government, which matters given what Ruth documented about the oversight board. He looked at her. He'll know within 48 hours that this has been filed. He'll respond. He has resources, and he'll use them. You need to understand what that looks like before it starts. I understand it, Callie said. He considered her. He had the quality of someone taking a real measure of a person, not a quick assessment, but a genuine one. Ruth said you would, he said finally. She said you were harder than you looked and smarter than anyone would assume. He picked up his coffee. She was very specific about that. Something moved in Callie's chest. She let it move and settle and did not try to name it. They worked through the rest of the dark hours and into the gray of early morning. Fletcher had a photocopier in the back room, and they copied everything twice the originals going back into the portfolio. The first set of copies into a separate folder that Fletcher locked in his office safe. The second set into a padded envelope he addressed to a colleague in Burlington with a covering letter he asked Callie to read before he sealed it. She read it carefully. It was precise and clear and did not overstate anything, which she understood instinctively was the right way to present this particular kind of evidence. Overstatement gave people room to argue with the frame. This letter gave them nowhere to stand except on the facts, and the facts were significant. By 7 in the morning, the injunction application was drafted. By 8, it was complete. At 8:45, Fletcher walked to the courthouse 2 streets over, and Callie sat in his office and drank a third cup of coffee and watched the town of Harwick come awake through the window. Silas Greer opened his store at 9. She watched him sweep the step, a small and ordinary act, and thought about Ruth standing at that counter for 40 years buying flour and hardware and whatever else a person needs to maintain a life in a place they have chosen and committed to. She thought about what it meant to choose a place and stay in it long enough that the place knew. Your face knew your order noticed when you were gone. Fletcher was back by 10. The judge had reviewed the application. The injunction was granted. He sat down across from her and set the court order on the desk between them. His expression was the controlled version of something considerably larger. "That's step one," he said. She nodded. "The quarry is frozen. No vehicle access, no removal of materials, no interference with the site pending investigation. EPA and FBI notifications go out this afternoon. What happens now? Now we wait for him to move, and we make sure we're ready when he does." Crane moved faster than either of them expected. By noon, the Crane Group lawyers had filed a motion to vacate the injunction on procedural grounds. By 2 in the afternoon, a story appeared on the website of a Burlington news outlet describing the situation in terms that Callie recognized as carefully shaped. The story referred to a contested property inheritance in a rural Vermont county and mentioned in the fourth paragraph that the central claimant was a recently aged-out foster care resident with no local ties, whose allegations had been characterized by Crane Group's legal team as without merit and potentially motivated by financial desperation. The word unstable did not appear in the story, but its absence was technical. Everything around it suggested the word without committing to it. Fletcher read the story on his computer and said nothing for a moment. "They're fast," Callie said. "They've been ready for this," he said. "They've had a version of this response prepared because they knew the evidence existed. They just didn't know where it was." She looked at the screen, at the careful language arranged around her life, like a frame around something they wanted people to see a particular way. "What do I do?" He turned from the computer. "Right now, nothing. You let the legal process do what it's designed to do. The injunction stands until they can argue it in front of the judge, and what they filed today is procedural noise. The substance of the evidence doesn't change." He paused. "But I want to get the copies to Burlington today. I want them off this property." He picked up the padded envelope they had prepared and handed it to his secretary, a woman named Greta who had worked in the office for 11 years and who had greeted Callie that morning with a professional pleasantness that asked no questions and required no explanation. "Can you get this on the noon mail?" Fletcher asked her. "Of course," Greta said. She took the envelope and went to her desk. Callie watched her go. There was something. She could not name it immediately. A small displacement in the air. Something in the way Greta had held the envelope a fraction too carefully, a fraction too long before she moved. It was the kind of thing that registered below the level of articulation, the kind of thing that 2 years in a group home and 16 years of learning to read rooms had trained her nervous system to notice before her mind had the language for it. She said nothing. She filed it. By the end of the day, the FBI field office had acknowledged receipt of the environmental data. The EPA regional coordinator had called Fletcher's office and requested a follow-up meeting for the following week. The injunction remained in place. From a legal standpoint, the day had gone well. That evening, Callie sat in the small room above Fletcher's office that he had cleared for her, a spare space with a narrow bed and a radiator that worked when it felt like it, and she thought about Greta holding the envelope. She thought about Pruitt in the barn. "The bench first," he had said. "Not the floor, not the perimeter. The bench, specifically." He had known about the bench before he arrived that night. Not because anyone told him in the last 12 hours. He had known about the bench since he searched the barn 6 months ago after Ruth died. He had found it and not been able to open it. That was what tonight had been a second attempt prompted by the fact that Callie had gone inside and stayed, which meant Greta was a different problem entirely. She lay on the narrow bed in the dark and followed the thread. What had Greta heard? She had been in the outer office when Callie arrived at 5 in the morning. She had not been there, but she had come in at 8:30 and overheard portions of the conversation with Fletcher. She had processed the copies. She had handled the Burlington envelope. She knew about the FBI meeting. She knew about the timeline. She knew the copies were moving. That was what she could have told Pruitt. Not the bench, the schedule. Callie got up in the morning and went downstairs early before Greta arrived, and she told Fletcher what she was thinking. She told him quietly and precisely without drama, laying out the sequence of observations the way Ruth had laid out the sequence of evidence. The bench, the 6 months, the second search triggered by her presence, Greta's role in a different part of the picture. Fletcher listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up, went to his filing cabinet, and pulled a folder. He laid it on the desk between them without opening it. 3 years ago, he said, my office handled a debt consolidation for a client who turned out to have borrowed from a private lender operating through a Delaware shell company. He paused. I didn't connect it at the time. He looked at the folder. Greta processed the initial intake. He opened the folder. The name of the lender on the documents was a company called Ridgecrest Capital Management, LLC. Callie looked at the ledger Ruth had compiled open on the desk beside the portfolio. She ran her finger down the list of names. She found it 3/4 of the way down. Ridgecrest Capital Management, a notation beside it in Ruth's handwriting. Crane Group Subsidiary. Registered Delaware 2009. Operates consumer lending in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. They looked at each other. Fletcher called Greta into the office when she arrived, and he told her in terms that were clear and not unkind that she was released from her position effective immediately, that he would provide a reference for future employment, and that he was aware of the nature of her relationship with Ridgecrest Capital. He told her that the information she had shared with Crane Group was relevant to a federal investigation and that she would need to make a decision about how she wanted to be positioned relative to that investigation. He said it all without accusation, simply as information she needed to have. Greta sat across from him and looked at her hands and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, I owe them $43,000. I've been paying it for 6 years and the principal hasn't moved. That is how it works, Fletcher said. That is how it is designed to work. She looked at the portfolio on the desk, at the ledger. She looked at Callie. He told me, she said quietly. He told me if I kept him informed, he would consider the debt satisfied. I told him about the FBI meeting, about when you were sending the envelope. He paused. I didn't know about the barn. I didn't know what was in it. Callie believed her. She thought about the dozens of names in the ledger, about the mechanisms by which a man with money and patience could reach into the lives of ordinary people and make them into instruments without those people ever fully understanding what they had become. She thought about her father's name in that ledger. She thought about the specific way these things work quietly and incrementally, until one day you looked up and realized you had been operating inside someone else's design for years. Greta Fletcher said, I am going to ask you to give a statement to the FBI. It will help us. It will also help you. He paused. Will you do that? She nodded. She nodded the way people nod when they have been carrying something for a long time and have finally found a surface to set it on. The backup copies had already gone to Burlington, which meant Crane's response to Greta's information had arrived too late. But that evening, Fletcher received word that the Crane Group lawyers had filed a motion alleging that portions of the original evidence had been obtained through unlawful surveillance and were therefore inadmissible. Private citizen, no professional authority, public land accessed without permission. Callie read the filing summary and thought about Ruth in the dark at the quarry's edge with a mail-order camera. She remembered something. Not something she had been told, something she had read. She went back to the journal. She had read it once through in the cold of the barn, but she had not yet returned to it with the specific question she now had. She sat at Fletcher's desk with the journal open and worked through the final months of entries with the attention of someone looking for a particular kind of detail. She found it in an entry from 14 months before Ruth's death. A man came to the door today. Federal employee, EPA Enforcement Division, name of Grant Weller. He showed me credentials. He told me he had been following an anonymous tip regarding illegal disposal at a decommissioned quarry site in Harwick County, and that his investigation had led him to believe I might have relevant information. He was careful and professional, and he did not push when I was hesitant. I made him tea, and I looked at his identification for a long time, and I decided he was what he said he was. We talked for 3 hours. I showed him what I had. He took notes. He told me that the evidence I had gathered was consistent with what his office had been developing from other angles, and that if I was willing to work with his investigation, everything I provided could be formally entered into the federal record under his office's authority. I said yes. I signed the cooperation agreement the following week. He gave me a copy, his office retained a copy, and I made a third copy, which I have placed with the materials below the floor. Everything I have collected since that meeting has been conducted in cooperation with an active federal investigation. Callie set the journal down. She went to the portfolio and went through it section by section, moving carefully through the photographs and the test results and the ledger pages looking for the document. It was near the back behind the water sample results, a single page on EPA letterhead with both signatures, Ruth's and Grant Weller's, and a case reference number that corresponded to an active federal investigation file. She carried it to Fletcher, who was on the phone, and she set it in front of him without interrupting, and she watched his eyes move across the page and then stop and then start again from the beginning. He ended the phone call. He picked up the document and held it the way you hold something you need to feel the physical reality of before you believe it. Every piece of evidence in this portfolio, he said, was gathered under active federal cooperation. It was not collected by a private citizen. It was collected by a civilian informant working with an EPA enforcement investigation. Yes, Callie said. His inadmissibility argument, Fletcher said, has no ground to stand on. The trial was 3 months away, and the months between were not easy months. Crane's legal team was skilled and expensive, and utterly willing to use every procedural mechanism available to delay, reframe, and complicate. They filed 7 separate motions between the injunction and the trial date. They requested continuances. They challenged the chain of custody on the water samples. They questioned the reliability of the camera timestamps on the photographs. They submitted a counter-affidavit from a hydrologist hired specifically for this purpose, who argued that the contamination evidence was inconclusive. Each challenge required a response, and each response required preparation, and the preparation fell to Fletcher, who worked long hours and did not complain about any of them. Callie worked alongside him. She had not planned to stay in Harwick. She had planned at some point to find a room in a place with more options to get a job to begin building the ordinary architecture of a life. But the staying happened gradually and then completely the way things happen when a place starts to recognize you and you start to recognize it back. Silas Greer began saving her the newspaper each morning folded to the county news section, leaving it on the counter before she arrived. The woman who ran the diner, a quiet person named June, who communicated primarily through the quality of what she put on the table, learned Callie's order and had it ready when she walked in. The plow driver who cleared Ridge Road made sure the path to the barn was passable after every storm, doing it without being asked, doing it in the specific way of people in small towns who express care through practical action and never mention it. She went to the barn often. It had stopped feeling threatening after the first week and had become something else, something she was still finding the right word for. She cleaned it methodically, working inward from the edges. She swept the floor, which took 3 days. She cleared the covered equipment and inventoried it and made a list of what might be salvageable and what had passed that point. She discovered that the workbench was in better structural condition than anything else in the building. Its joints still tight, its surface level, its drawers sliding cleanly when the wood dried out from the winter damp. She kept Ruth's tools on the pegboard exactly as they had been, the outlines traced in white paint behind each one. She did not move anything. She cleaned around it all and put everything back exactly where it had been because the arrangement was not hers to change. She did not go to the hiding place under the floor. She let it remain closed. The names in the ledger came to her one by one over those months. They came to Fletcher's office first, mostly having heard through the network of a small town that someone was building a case, and that the case involved Ridgecrest Capital and its 15 years of operation in the county. They were not dramatic arrivals. They were quiet ones. An older woman named Vera, who wore a good coat that had seen better years, sat across from Fletcher and explained in measured terms how she had borrowed money to keep her property after her husband's illness and had been paying interest for 6 years and now owed more than she had originally borrowed. She had a daughter in Montpellier who didn't know. She had been afraid to say anything because she didn't understand what could be done and was more afraid of hoping than of not hoping. A man named Carol in his late 50s who had run a small machine shop on the edge of town and had needed capital for equipment upgrades and had signed papers he didn't fully understand and had been in a state of managed financial crisis ever since. He had kept the shop open by cutting his own salary to almost nothing for 3 years. His wife had thought he was managing things. He hadn't known how to tell her. A family husband and wife who had borrowed against their house to cover the cost of their son's medical treatment and now sat across from Fletcher with the specific exhaustion of people who have been afraid for a long time and have not had anywhere to put the fear. The husband held his wife's hand the entire time he spoke. He did not let go of it once. Callie met with each of them, not because Fletcher asked her to, because she needed to, because the ledger was a document and these were the people behind the document, and she felt she owed them the act of looking at them directly, of understanding that what Ruth had built had dimensions she could not see from the pages alone. She told them when they asked who she was and why she was there. She told them about the barn and the journal and the hidden safe. She told them enough, and what she told them had an effect on their willingness to participate in the federal process that Fletcher described quietly and only once as significant. Courage, he told her one evening as they worked late in the office, is frequently contagious. You are the source of it in this particular outbreak. She told him that was too generous. He told her Ruth had apparently been right about her being smarter than anyone would assume and went back to his documents. The trial began on a Monday in early March. The federal courthouse in Burlington was not large, but it was dignified in the specific way of federal institutions. The weight of the process visible in the architecture, the high ceilings and the dark wood, and the quality of the light coming through the tall windows. Callie sat at the plaintiff's table beside Fletcher in a wool blazer she had bought from a consignment store in town, her hair pulled back, her hands in her lap. Victor Crane sat at the defense table across the aisle. She had not seen him in person before. He was older than she had imagined from the context of the story, somewhere in his late 60s, a man of considerable physical presence that had begun to condense with age into something denser and harder. He wore a suit that was clearly expensive without being ostentatious, the suit of a man who understood the visual language of serious money and chose to speak it quietly. He carried himself with the practiced ease of someone who had been in difficult rooms before and had always left them on his own terms. He did not look at Callie when she came in. He did not look at her when the session was called to order. He looked at the bench, at the jury, at his lead attorney. He looked everywhere a man in his position needs to look to signal that he is in command of the room. He did not look at the 18-year-old girl with the worn blazer who had walked through snow at 5 in the morning, carrying his undoing in a waterproof portfolio. The prosecution opened first, the federal attorney laying out the structure of the case with a clarity that Callie recognized as the product of extensive preparation. Environmental contamination of a federal magnitude. A documented pattern of predatory lending through a series of deliberately obscured corporate entities. An orchestrated interference with a state child welfare process. 37 named victims in the lending operation alone. Evidence gathered over 14 months by a civilian informant working in formal cooperation with the EPA, every element collected under federal authority. Crane's lead attorney, a man from a Boston firm who had been doing this for 30 years and moved through the courtroom with the confidence of someone billing $400 an hour, stood for the opening for the defense and presented a counter-narrative of impressive construction. An elderly woman with a history of eccentric behavior in an isolated lifestyle. Evidence gathered by unconventional means. A young woman with no legal standing and no relevant expertise making claims about complex corporate activity she did not have the background to understand. He used the word misguided 3 times and the word unfortunate twice. He did not use the word unstable, But he knew how to build a space where a jury could arrive at a word without being handed it. Fletcher had prepared Callie for this. He had told her in the weeks before trial that the defense would attempt to make the case about her and Ruth rather than about Crane, because that was the strategy available when the underlying evidence was strong. He told her that the best response to personal attack in a legal context was the evidence itself, and that the evidence was in his professional assessment exceptional. He had also told her there would be one moment probably toward the end of the defense's procedural challenges where the inadmissibility argument would be their last significant play. He told her they had something for that moment, and they needed to be patient and let it come. The trial moved through its phases over 4 days. Witnesses testified, the EPA investigator Grant Weller among them, a careful and precise man who presented the technical elements of the contamination evidence in terms that were clear without being simplified, who confirmed the cooperation agreement with Ruth Marsh and explained its legal significance in language the jury could follow. An environmental chemist testified about the water sample results, quantifying the contamination levels in terms that removed any ambiguity about the scale and direction of the problem. A forensic accountant presented the ledger and explained transaction by transaction how Ridgecrest Capital had been structured to maximize debt accumulation in its borrowers, showing the jury the specific mechanisms by which ordinary people became trapped in obligations they could not escape. Greta testified. She was brief and honest, and she did not attempt to mitigate what she had done. She testified about the nature of her debt, about Crane's offer, about the information she had passed to Pruitt. She was a witness for the prosecution, and she testified against the man who had indebted her, and the particular courage required to do that in front of a room full of people was visible in the way she held herself at the stand, straight and still, and looking directly at the attorney asking her questions rather than at the floor. Dex Pruitt had accepted a cooperation agreement. He was not in the courtroom. Victor Crane's attorneys presented their defense over a day and a half. They called character witnesses, business associates, and civic figures who described a man of standing and contribution, a job creator, a civic participant, a person of reputation. They challenged the chain of custody on several pieces of evidence, with arguments that were technically sophisticated and ultimately insufficient. They questioned the reliability of photographs taken with a consumer-grade camera under low-light conditions at a considerable distance. And then on the afternoon of the fourth day, Crane's lead attorney stood and made the inadmissibility argument. He was articulate and thorough, and had clearly prepared this section of his argument with particular care. The evidence in question, gathered by a private individual on private property and in areas where the individual had no professional authority, could not be introduced as evidence under federal evidentiary standards, he said. The cooperation agreement claimed by the prosecution was a unilateral document prepared by a field investigator who had no authority to deputize civilian evidence collection after the fact. The entire evidentiary foundation of the prosecution's case was built on material that should never have been admitted. The judge listened. The jury listened. The room was very quiet. Fletcher stood. He was not a man who performed in courtrooms. He was a man who prepared. And the thing he was about to present had been prepared for this specific moment, held back through 4 days of trial for exactly this argument, the way you hold a clear answer until the question has been fully stated so that the force of the answer is proportional to the weight of the question. He introduced the cooperation agreement into evidence. Not the copy from the portfolio, though that was there as well. The original obtained through subpoena from the EPA field office, bearing Grant Weller's signature and the official seal of the EPA Enforcement Division, and a case reference number that cross-referenced an active federal investigation that had been opened 18 months before Ruth Marsh's death. He then introduced a second document, a formal memorandum from the EPA's General Counsel prepared at the request of the federal prosecutor and addressed to the court, clarifying in precise legal language that a cooperation agreement of this type executed by an authorized field investigator in connection with an active federal enforcement action carried full evidentiary authority for all materials collected under its scope. The agreement had been executed appropriately, documented correctly, and filed with the relevant federal offices at the time of its signing. Ruth Marsh's evidence had not been collected by a private citizen acting alone. It had been collected by a civilian cooperating witness in a federal investigation operating under federal authority with federal documentation of every step she took. The inadmissibility argument had no legal surface left to stand on. Crane's attorney sat down. Callie watched Victor Crane's face. She had been watching it in measured intervals throughout the trial, watching for the thing underneath the practiced composure, the thing that all that composure was designed to conceal. She saw it now. Not a dramatic crack, not anger or fear in any recognizable form, but a settling, a small and almost imperceptible lowering of something that had been held very specifically in place. The posture of a man who has just understood that the position he believed he occupied no longer exists, and has not existed for some time, and the only thing that has changed is that he now knows it. He did not look at Callie. He looked at the table in front of him for a long moment, and then he looked at his attorney, and what passed between them required no words. The jury deliberated for 6 hours across 2 days. Guilty on federal environmental contamination charges. Guilty on racketeering. Guilty on fraud. Guilty on obstruction of a state child welfare process. When the verdict was read, Callie was looking at the window at the far end of the room, at the way the March light came through it at an angle that was almost warm, the first suggestion in the light that the season was considering changing. She registered the words and let them arrive one at a time and settle into their proper places. She thought about her grandmother in January driving down Ridge Road in the dark, the belt on her truck squealing in the cold, a camera on the seat beside her. She thought about a woman at a kitchen table the morning after a phone call sitting for a long time with the water running in the sink. She thought about a journal hidden in a bench leg and a note that said, "Trust the grain," and a key that was heavy in the hand for reasons that had nothing to do with the iron. Fletcher put his hand on the table near hers, not quite touching the gesture of a man who understands the weight of a moment and does not want to interrupt it with anything unnecessary. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. It was procedurally brief and legally decisive. Victor Crane received 12 years. Crane Group's assets were frozen pending civil claims from the 37 documented lending victims and the state environmental remediation process. The quarry would be sealed and assessed. The contamination would be mapped. The cleanup would take years. The county would need clean water in the interim. And there was exactly one private well in the area with the geology and the volume to provide a supplemental source while the remediation proceeded. After the sentencing hearing, the court handled a probate matter that had been consolidated with the case at Fletcher's request. The reading of Ruth Marsh's will, which was brief and clear in the specific language of a woman who had known exactly what she wanted and had taken care to say it unambiguously. The property at Ridge Road, Harwick, Vermont, 1 acre of land and associated structures conveyed unconditionally to Callie Marsh. And the contents of the personal safe located on said property, $50,000 in cash, conveyed unconditionally to Callie Marsh, with a note expressing the wish that it be used however Callie saw most fit. The clerk read the amount and looked up briefly and looked back down. Fletcher glanced at Callie. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it in the barn and in the room above Fletcher's office, and in the long walk she had taken along Ridge Road in the weeks before the trial. She had thought about it when Vera sat across from Fletcher with her hands folded and talked about the house she was trying not to lose. She had thought about it when Carol described cutting his own salary to nothing for 3 years, while his wife believed things were fine. She had thought about what Ruth had written. Take the money and go. You have earned the right to simply live. She stood up. The judge looked at her. She was not sure of the correct procedural form for what she wanted to say, and she said it anyway directly, in the clear voice she had been practicing, not in any rehearsed sense, but in the way that the truth becomes clearer. The more honestly you look at it, the way a window becomes more transparent, the more carefully you clean it. You clean. My grandmother left me that money as a choice, she said. She wanted me to be free to leave or to stay. I'm staying. She paused. The people in this county who borrowed from Ridgecrest Capital are going to spend years trying to recover what was taken from them. Most of what was taken can't be returned by any court order. But this can be. She looked at the clerk, then back at the judge. I'm asking the court to receive the $50,000 as a voluntary contribution to whatever restitution process is established for those victims, distributed equitably among the 37 documented cases. The room was very quiet. She looked at the table across the aisle at the empty chair where Victor Crane had sat. She looked at the window with its March light coming through at an angle that had almost warmth in it. Ruth Marsh didn't save me with money, she said. She saved me with the truth. This belongs to the people who had things taken from them that money can't fully replace. But this is what there is, and it belongs to them. She sat down. Fletcher said nothing. He was looking at the bench. In the fourth row, Silas Greer, who had driven to Burlington that morning in his old truck and had sat through the sentencing hearing without speaking to anyone, put his hands over his face for a moment. Then he took them away and looked at the ceiling for a long time and breathed. The judge accepted the contribution into the record. Spring arrived in Harwick the way it always arrives in northern Vermont. Not as a sudden change, but as a negotiation, the cold yielding incrementally, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes first, and then from the fields, and then finally reluctantly from the forest floor where it lingered longest, as if the trees were providing it cover. The hills, which had been white and then gray, turned a color that had no single name, something between gold and green, the specific color of new growth that knows it will be tested again before it is safe. Callie hired a crew of 4 men from town in April. They were not expensive, and they were skilled in the particular way of people who have spent their lives maintaining structures in a climate that does not forgive inattention. They replaced the roof over 3 weeks, the new metal gleaming against the spring sky, visible from the road as something that would last. They rehung the main doors on new hardware, the crooked one coming level for the first time in what the oldest of the crew estimated had been at least 20 years. They replaced the 3 windows in the back room, the old glass giving way to new, and the light that came through was different afterward, fuller and more direct, arriving with an honesty the old glass had been too clouded to permit. She worked alongside them when she could and watched when she couldn't, and learned more in those 3 weeks about the practical maintenance of a structure than she had accumulated in 18 years of other kinds of education. The interior she did herself. She swept the barn floor again methodically, though it was already cleaner than when she had arrived. She organized what remained of the stored equipment, disposed of what was genuinely past saving, set aside what might still have use. She found under the canvas tarp beside the old tractor a set of wooden carpenter's tools, hand planes and chisels, and a spoke shave that had been stored with the same care as everything else Ruth had chosen to keep. She wrapped them in clean cloth and put them on the shelf above the workbench. She did not move the workbench. She did not rearrange the tools on the pegboard or relabel the jars. She cleaned everything carefully with a soft cloth, working around Ruth's handwriting without touching it, and she put it all back exactly where it had been. The arrangement was a record. It was the last thing in Ruth's own hand that existed in physical space in the world, and Callie was not going to be the one who changed it. She was sanding the backroom floor one afternoon in early May when she found herself sitting with the sandpaper in her hand and no specific intention to stop, and just sitting there. The flagstone in the center of the room was in front of her. She had not lifted it since the night she had recovered the portfolio. She had moved it slightly that same night so the crescent mark faced the wall. Now she looked at it, at the smooth gray surface and the seam around its edge, and the faint curve of the mark visible at the corner. She thought about the night she had crouched in that corner with the portfolio pressed against her chest and not breathed. She thought about the beam of Pruitt's flashlight crossing the wall beside her. She thought about running through the pines in the dark and the cold and the snow with numb feet, and the portfolio inside her jacket, the most important thing to keep warm. She thought about what the flagstone represented. Not just the safe below it, which was empty now, the cash gone to the restitution process, and the evidence gone to federal custody. But the act of it. Ruth alone planning this with the precision of someone who understood that the person coming after her would need more than luck. Ruth carving a crescent in a stone with something sharp and patient, trusting that a girl she had never met would look carefully enough to find it. She reached over and turned the flagstone until the crescent mark faced outward toward the room, visible again to anyone who looked. She had decided not to hide it. It was part of the story. The story was the whole point. She stood up and went back to sanding. By June, the barn was finished. Not restored to what it had been because she did not have the record of what it had been before the long years of disrepair, but brought to what it was now, which was a different thing, a version of the structure that had passed through its worst years and come out the other side of them into something that could be used and lived in and worked in and relied upon. Something that had been tested and had not fallen. The light inside was exceptional. Ruth had known it would be, had positioned the building on the acre to catch the southern exposure through most of the day, the same careful intelligence that had gone into everything else she had planned and built and left behind. In the mornings, the light came in low and golden through the new windows in the back room. By afternoon, it moved across the barn floor in long, warm angles that showed the grain of the packed earth and made the place feel less like a shelter and more like something chosen. Callie stood in the doorway one evening in late June, with the last of the day's light coming through behind her and falling across the barn floor, and looked at the space she had made. The workbench stood where it had always stood, the tools on the pegboard, the jars on the shelf. Ruth's handwriting on each label, small and careful and built to last. The back room with its new windows and its leveled floor, and the flagstone in its center with the small crescent mark facing outward. The carpenter's tools wrapped in clean cloth on the upper shelf. The clean swept floor where the old tractor used to be, the tractor gone now. Hauled away by a man from the next town who thought he might be able to do something with it, replaced by space and light. She had a meeting with Fletcher the following week about the property's legal status going forward. There were questions about the water rights specifically, which the EPA remediation process had elevated to a matter of county significance. Clean water in a county where the water table had been compromised turned out to be not simply a private asset. There were conversations to be had about easements and access and the particular complexity of a single private well becoming relevant to a larger public need. None of it would be simple. All of it would take time. She did not mind. She had learned over the last 8 months that the things worth protecting rarely resolve quickly. They required patience and attention and the willingness to do the same careful work on the same problem day after day without the reassurance of a visible ending. Ruth had known this. Ruth had lived it for years. She thought about the 2 years she had spent in Hargrove House in the system, in the institution of carefully managed expectations and numbered case files. She thought about the morning of her birthday, the manila envelope on Ms. Vreeland's particle board desk, the key that seemed too heavy for its size. She understood now what the weight had been. It was not the iron. It was what the iron meant. Ruth had held that key through the last years of her life, had held it knowing that at some specific future moment she would not be alive, and a girl she had never been allowed to know would arrive in a Vermont town and put that key in a rusted lock and find out whether the thing built in the dark with patience and love was strong enough to stand. It had been. It was. She had not been given a barn. She had been given a choice carefully constructed over decades by a woman who understood that the most important things cannot be given directly, can only be arranged so that the person who needs them has the real chance to find them and the real freedom to decide what to do with them once found. Ruth had not made the choice for her. Ruth had made the choice possible. Callie had found it. She had chosen the harder road when the easier one was right there, available, reasonable, waiting to take her somewhere with less cold and less snow and less history. She had made the choice not because she was brave. She did not think of herself as brave, but because once she knew the truth, she could not unknow it, and the truth had required a response. She had simply been the person standing there when the response was needed, and she had not walked away. She looked at the hills visible through the open barn door, the Vermont hills in June going deep green in the evening light, the tree line dense and dark at the ridge, the sky above them moving toward the colors of late day. She looked at the property she was standing on, 1 acre of stubborn New England earth, with a clean well underneath it and a repaired barn on top of it, and a history running deeper than she could see. She thought of the phrase she had read by failing flashlight on a frozen floor and had not fully understood until she had lived her way into it, until she had carried it through courtrooms and snowstorms and late nights at a lawyer's desk and the specific slow work of putting a damaged building back together piece by piece. Trust the grain. Find what is built to last. The light shifted. The evening was coming in from the east, the air cooling towards something comfortable, the particular sweetness of a Vermont June evening that has earned itself by getting through the winter. Somewhere in the pines, a bird was doing something complicated and repetitive that she almost recognized. She was not case number 412 anymore. She was not a name on a list or a file in a cabinet or someone's problem handed to the next desk down the line. She was a person standing in a doorway of a building she had helped put back together in a town that had come to know her face and save her the newspaper and have her order ready on land that had roots going down further than she could see. She had roots now, too. They went down through the acre of cold, stubborn earth and further into the story of a woman she had never met, who had loved her from a distance for 18 years, and had built out of that love and that distance the most careful and complete inheritance she could manage. It was not a fortune. It was not a house with a family inside it, or an easy beginning, or any of the ordinary things that other people arrived at 18 already holding. It was not the life that would have been hers if the road on Route 9 had been dry and a truck had not crossed a line. It was a barn, a key, a grain of wood pressed in exactly the right place, a truth buried in the earth patient as stone waiting for exactly the right person to come and lift it into the light. She turned back inside and pulled the door closed behind her, the new hinges moving smoothly, the latch catching cleanly the sound of it solid and final and right, the sound of something built to last doing exactly what it was made to do.